In the summer of 1883, in a dusty Wyoming town, a father made a choice that would haunt him forever. He sold his 19-year-old daughter, Eliza, to a rancher named Nathaniel Garrett for a horse. But what that drunken father didn't know was that the lonely widower with 3 sons would treat his daughter like the treasure she truly was. This is their story, a tale of a girl the world called worthless and the man who proved she was made of gold. Clearwater baked beneath a high Wyoming sun. Outside the saloon, John Monroe leaned on the hitch rail, bottle in hand, eyes yellowed by drink. Across the street, a chestnut mare pawed at the dust, her hide gleaming like burnished copper. Nathaniel Garrett, a widowed rancher with 3 young sons, studied her steady stance, then lifted his gaze to the man selling more than an animal. "That mare's worth more than the mouths I'm feeding," John rasped. "You could use a woman's hand at your place." "Take the girl. She's 19, reads, cooks, sews. The horse for her." "Fair trade." Nathaniel's jaw set. "I'm not buying cattle." John laughed, the sound cracked and cruel. "Call it what you like." Through the window of the general store, Eliza Monroe sat by the light, mending a torn shirt, unaware that her worth was being measured in reins and coin. Nathaniel hesitated. The mare snorted. Coins clinked. He knew the bargain had been spoken wrong. Monroe, thinking to trade his daughter for another man's horse, too drunk to see that no decent man would take that deal straight. Nathaniel's conscience turned hard inside him. If he walked away, the girl would still be sold, only to someone worse. When Monroe stumbled back into the saloon, boasting of the trade, Nathaniel crossed the street. The chestnut mare remained tied where she'd been from the start, reins looped to his wagon post. The drunk hadn't even noticed he'd never taken her. Inside the store, boots scraped. John's shadow filled the doorway. "Pack your things," he said. "You sold me?" she whispered. "That horse'll plow," he muttered. "You only eat." She gathered her 2 books, her mother's locket, and what few clothes still fit, folded them into a worn canvas bag that had once been her mother's sewing satchel, and with that, her dignity. Nathaniel waited outside, hat in hand. "Miss Monroe," he said softly. "I'm Nathaniel Garrett." She met his eyes. "I understand, Mr. Garrett." He tipped his head once, more vow than gesture. "You're not bought, ma'am." "Not by me." The wind rose, lifting dust between them. Coins lay forgotten somewhere in the dirt, and the mare stamped once, steady between the traces. And somewhere inside that swirling silence, a single question began to form. What Nathaniel did next would silence the town for months to come. By noon, the wagon rolled north out of Clearwater. The saloon faded behind them, its swinging doors whispering shut like the end of a bad chapter. Eliza sat stiff-backed beside Nathaniel Garrett, hands folded in her lap, watching the road unspool through waves of heat. The chestnut mare trotted steady between the traces, her only familiar thing in a world that had just traded her name for reins. Nathaniel glanced at her once, then fixed his eyes on the horizon. "You can ride if you'd rather," he said quietly. "She's yours now," Eliza replied, voice thin but steady. "Like me." He frowned at that. "Nobody owns anybody, Miss Monroe." "Not out here." They rode on in silence. The wagon creaked, the harness leather squeaked, and the wind carried the dry sweetness of sagebrush. Now and then he passed her the canteen, wordless. She drank carefully, avoiding the brush of his hand. By evening they reached a dry creek bed and stopped to make camp. Nathaniel gathered wood while she spread a blanket near the wagon. He offered jerky and biscuits from his pack. She accepted, thanking him with a small nod, the first fragile civility between them. When darkness fell, coyotes began their lonely song beyond the hills. Nathaniel sat by the fire, staring into the flames, the light carving quiet lines into his face. He was a man who'd seen too much loss and learned to bury the ache under work and silence. Eliza sat on the blanket by the fire, the book open in her lap, words barely visible in the flicker. When the flames settled to coals, she climbed into the wagon and lay awake, listening to the wind sift through the sage and the soft cough of the mare. Nathaniel didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. But when he lay down on the ground beside the wagon, he faced outward, away from her, keeping watch until dawn. The next day, the Garrett ranch came into view just as the sun tipped west. A modest clapboard house stood above a dry creek, its porch sagging, shutters half askew, the fence mended in too many places to count. Beyond it stretched pasture the color of copper dust, dotted with grazing cattle and the shimmer of distant mountains. Eliza studied it in silence. The house wasn't fine, but it was honest. It looked like it had been built by hands that meant to stay. Nathaniel reined the wagon to a stop. "It's not much," he said, "but it keeps the wind off and the roof don't leak." She nodded. "A sound roof's worth more than painted trim." He helped her down. The boards underfoot were solid. The step creaked, but held. A child's ball lay in the dust, sun-bleached and forgotten. Through the open doorway drifted the faint scent of bread gone stale and wood smoke that hadn't burned in days. Inside, the rooms felt still, too still. 3 small beds lined the wall in the corner room. A woman's bonnet hung from a peg, its ribbons faded by time. Eliza traced a finger over the dust on the mantel and said quietly, "You built this yourself?" "With Sarah," he answered. The name hung between them like breath in cold air. "She died birthing the youngest." Eliza set her bag by the door. "You want supper made?" "If you're able," he said. "Boys'll be in from chores soon." He showed her the small spare room off the hall, clean, plain, and private. The door shut with a solid click. The key turned smooth in her hand. For the first time in years, a lock answered to her, not against her. As dusk deepened, she smoothed the coverlet on the narrow bed and stood for a moment in the quiet room, the scent of soap and cedar steadying her. It wasn't comfort yet, but it was safety, and that was more than she'd dared to hope for. Evening settled across the prairie like cooling embers. From the kitchen window, Eliza Monroe watched 3 figures cross the yard, dust-covered, sunburned, and loud with the kind of energy that only boys carry home from work. Thomas, tall for 12, led the way with a practiced swagger. James, 9, trailed behind, swinging a rope in idle circles. William, 6, clutched a crooked wooden stick he called his rifle. When they spotted their father standing beside a stranger, the noise died. Nathaniel cleared his throat. "This is Miss Eliza Monroe. She'll be helping around the house." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "We don't need help." Eliza met his look without flinching. "Good. Then we'll get along fine." James studied her curiously. "Can you read?" "I can," she said. "And if you ask polite, I might teach you more than that." William pressed close to Nathaniel's leg, half hiding. Eliza smiled gently. "I don't bite. Only burn biscuits sometimes." That earned a faint grin from James. Even Thomas's mouth twitched before he caught himself. Inside, the kitchen smelled of stew and wood smoke. Eliza set bowls on the table while Nathaniel washed up. The boys watched her quietly, as if measuring what kind of woman had stepped into their late mother's place. When she served them first, not herself. Thomas frowned. "Pa always eats first." "Then Pa's due a rest," Eliza said evenly. "Tonight we'll let the young men go first." Nathaniel entered just in time to see Thomas hesitate, then obey. He said nothing, only took his seat and bowed his head as Eliza murmured grace. After supper, when William yawned, she drew a small book from her satchel. Your father said you boys liked stories, she said, glancing toward the table. William climbed close, eyes heavy, while James leaned forward, eager, and Thomas lingered by the doorway, pretending not to listen. She smiled faintly, opened the book, and began to read. The lamplight pooled gold around them. By the time the last line fell, William had fallen asleep against her sleeve. James's head rested on his arms, content. Thomas stayed still, gaze lowered, as though the story had reached further than he meant it to. Nathaniel watched quietly from the door, the crease of his brow unfolding for the first time in years. Weeks passed, marked not by calendars but by chores and small mercies. Morning light spilled through the kitchen window, where Eliza Monroe kneaded dough, sleeves rolled high, hair damp with work. The smell of yeast and wood smoke drifted through the house, chasing away the long-kept scent of loneliness. The boys learned her rhythms before they learned her history. William, the youngest, brought her eggs each morning, sometimes whole, sometimes broken. James hovered nearby with his primer, reading haltingly while she worked. And Thomas, who'd once glared at her across the supper table, began mending fence beside her without being asked. When William tore his only good shirt on a nail, he came to her in tears. She took the cloth from his shaking hands and said gently, "I'm not your ma, William, but I can still fix it." The needle flashed in lamplight. Within minutes, the rent was gone. The boy stared, then wrapped his small arms around her waist. For a heartbeat she froze, then returned the hug, careful and certain. Later that week she found James hiding in the barn, his book open to a page he couldn't master. "I'm stupid," he muttered. Eliza sat beside him on a bale of hay. "You're learning," she said. "That's what smart people do. They keep going." From that night on, they read together after supper, her voice low and patient, his confidence growing with each line. By the 6th week, even Thomas began to soften. When a ranch hand made a crude remark about the woman Garrett bought, Thomas's fist struck first. Nathaniel heard the commotion and came running, but the ranch hand was already backing down. Eliza knelt by Thomas, wiping blood from his knuckles. "Next time," she said quietly. "Words are sharper than fists." He nodded, shamefaced, but his eyes shone with loyalty. That night, as she finished mending by lantern light, Nathaniel paused in the doorway. "You've done something I couldn't," he said. She looked up, thread between her fingers. "What's that?" "Made this house feel alive again." He didn't linger for an answer, just tipped his hat and left her to the soft hum of crickets and the steady pulse of belonging she was finally starting to feel. The last of summer burned itself out across the plains. Days shortened, nights cooled, and Nathaniel Garrett found his ranch humming smoother than it had in years. The ledgers balanced, the boys laughed again, and the quiet in the house no longer sounded like loss. He'd never planned to care about the woman he'd brought home that March. Need had made him practical, nothing more. Yet every time he passed the open kitchen door and saw Eliza Monroe bent over her work, sleeves rolled, hair escaping its braided bun, something inside him eased. He'd built this life out of routine, dawn rides, hard labor, early nights. But lately he'd catch himself pausing, just watching. She'd hum while she cooked, soft tunes without words. Sometimes he'd hear William giggling at her stories, James reading aloud in halting confidence while she corrected him gently, or Thomas trying to disguise his pride when she praised his handwriting. The house had grown warm again, not from fire, but from her steady hands. One evening he found her in the barn tending the chestnut mare, the very horse that had once been her price. The animal had cut its leg on barbed wire. Eliza knelt beside it, whispering as she worked, steady and sure. "You're worth more than he ever knew," she murmured. "We both are." Nathaniel stopped in the doorway, something tightening in his chest. She hadn't noticed him yet. Lamplight pooled over her hands, gilding her hair and the patient animal's flank. He'd seen beauty before, but not like this. Quiet, earned, unself-conscious. When she looked up and caught him watching, he meant to speak. Instead, he only tipped his hat. "You've a way with hurt things," he said. Her smile was faint, uncertain. "I've had practice." That night he sat at the kitchen table long after the lamp burned low. Ledger opened before him, but the numbers blurred. He thought about her courage, her calm, her laughter with the boys, and realized that for the first time since Sarah's death, he wanted to live rather than simply endure. He closed the book, leaned back, and whispered into the stillness. She could leave tomorrow if she wanted. God help me. I hope she doesn't. Saturday came bright and windless, the kind of day when all of Clearwater found its way to town. Eliza Monroe rode beside Nathaniel Garrett in the wagon, a basket of eggs and mended shirts at her feet. She wore a freshly pressed calico dress, plain but neat, and her hair, tied with a blue ribbon, caught the sunlight like thread spun from corn silk. They hadn't been to town together before. Eliza's hand stayed folded in her lap, her face calm, but her pulse beat quick under her collar. Nathaniel noticed, though he said nothing. The general store buzzed with voices and creaking floorboards. When they stepped inside, conversation dropped to a hush sharp enough to hear the door hinge sigh. Behind the counter, Mr. Webb, the storekeeper, cleared his throat but didn't greet them. At the far end, Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, crisp in lace and judgment, let her words fall like stones. "Well," she said loudly, "looks like Garrett finally brought the girl he bought." A few nervous laughs rippled through the room. Eliza's cheeks burned, but she held her ground. Nathaniel's voice came low, steady. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, "you watch that tongue." Her smile was sweet poison. "I only speak what everyone knows." Nathaniel took one step closer, his boots thudding like punctuation. "My wife manages my home, raises my sons, and keeps this ranch running. She reads Latin, balances accounts better than I ever could, and delivered a breech calf last week that'd be dead under lesser hands. You tell me, ma'am, what do you do besides ruin decent mornings?" The store went still as a graveyard. Even Mr. Webb froze mid-measure of flour. Eliza's heart hammered, but she said nothing. Her dignity spoke louder than any defense could. Mrs. Henderson's mouth opened, then shut again. Nathaniel laid coins on the counter, took the sack of sugar she'd come to buy, and turned to Eliza. "Ready to go home?" he asked. She nodded, her voice soft but sure. "Home sounds good." When they stepped outside, the whispering began again, only different this time. Some nodded as they passed. A few smiled, small and respectful. Eliza lifted her chin to the sunlight, the warmth on her face feeling like something she'd earned. Autumn came early that year. Morning frost glazed the pasture fences, and the sound of hammer and saw echoed from the barn, where repairs never seemed to end. Eliza Garrett, for by now she'd earned the name in every way but ceremony, had settled into the rhythm of ranch life like she'd been born to it. She rose before dawn, brewed coffee before Nathaniel came down, and always left enough heat in the stove for the boys' breakfasts. When the roof leaked after the first cold rain, she climbed the ladder herself, dress hem pinned, hammer in hand. By winter, no one in Clearwater doubted she could outwork half the men in the county. But it wasn't just labor that marked her worth. She taught James his sums and Thomas his letters well enough that even the schoolteacher commented. She showed William how to plant winter greens, saying, "You feed the soil like you'd feed a friend." When Nathaniel worried over ledgers, she stayed up beside him, candlelight catching the gold in her hair. "You're paying too much for feed," she said, tracing the columns. "They're adding 10% that isn't yours to lose." He smiled faintly. Then we'll stop losing. The ranch began to prosper. Debt fell away like old bark from a tree. By the time the snow melted, they'd saved near $40, almost the sum her father once took for her. Nathaniel didn't mention it, but he wrote the number carefully in the margins of his ledger, as if to mark the turning of something sacred. That spring, a mare foaled early and struggled. Eliza knelt in the straw, sleeves rolled, hands steady as she guided the slick, trembling newborn into the world. When the creature let out its first cry, Nathaniel swore he'd never seen anything so near to grace. "You've saved us again," he said, voice thick. Eliza brushed sweat from her brow. "Just did what was needed." That night, over supper, the boys argued softly about names for the foal. Thomas suggested Fortune. Eliza smiled at that. "Seems fitting. We've all found a bit of it." And Nathaniel, watching her laugh with the children, realized that the ranch no longer belonged to him alone. It belonged to them, to all of them, and most of all to the woman who'd turned work into love and hardship into home.